It's Bones. Listen.
Oh, Bones.
You know what I think of you.
You'll bring a tear to my eye.
I know, man. I know.
During the 2017-2018 season, the Winnipeg Jets were one of the best teams in the NHL and fell just short of heading to the Stanley Cup Finals, losing to Vegas in 5 games. It did appear that this team was still going to be strong, though. It appeared that the next few years were going to be very blissful for the Winnipeg Jets, and this was only the start of many cup runs for this team. But that never happened. If we fast forward to the 2021-2022 season, the Winnipeg Jets are a team held together by scotch tape and chewing gum. But many of their pieces still remained from the 2017-2018 team, like Paul Maurice, still the head coach of the Winnipeg Jets. Blake Wheeler was still the captain, Mark Scheifele was still the number 1 centerman, Kyle Connor and Connor Hellebuck are still there as well, growing into some of the best players on the Jets. And this team never made it back to the Western Conference Finals, never made it to that Stanley Cup Final, like many predicted they would by now. So what happened to this team? Well, a lot went wrong. Over time, this team got stale. Paul Maurice still the head coach, with much of the same core that was there in the 2017-2018 year. He was really trying to win a Stanley Cup with that core. This team believed in that core, and while these were still very good players and a team that on paper could go pretty far, the locker room was a mess. It seemed that Paul Maurice's words and those of his coaching staff were falling on deaf ears at this point. Add in the fact that Blake Wheeler as the captain wasn't really going well in the locker room either, rubbing players the wrong way, and while he was being hyper-focused on trying to win, at times his intensity came off the wrong way and, kind of split up this locker room. Players did not want to play in Winnipeg, and a disgruntled Patrick Laine in the 2020-2021 season was traded for Pierre-Luc Dubois. Dubois came in, he looked like, maybe this team wasn't going to be so stale anymore. Maybe this was the piece that the Jets needed to go further, but he ended up being a larger distraction as in the offseason it was revealed that he would not be signing long-term with the Winnipeg Jets. This team was a disaster, and Paul Maurice ended up being fired halfway through the 21-22 season, which brought in assistant coach Dave Lowry. He was more of the same. The Jets ended up not making the playoffs this season, and the vibes were at an all-time low. There was some hope, though, as now, with Paul Maurice gone and Dave Lowry out the door, with the rest of the assistant coaches, the Jets could start fresh for the first time in a long time at the head coaching position and their entire coaching staff as a whole. And the biggest fish out there was Barry Trotz, Manitoba-born Barry Trotz, Stanley Cup winner Barry Trotz. What was not to like about a hire like this to bring people back into the building, get people excited again, turn around your franchise? It didn't happen. Barry Trotz ended up taking the job with the Nashville Predators to be their general manager, which left Winnipeg scrambling. And without many options remaining, the Winnipeg Jets had hired Rick Bowness as head coach of the Winnipeg Jets. Rick Bowness came in needing to clean up a massive mess. Was he Barry Trotz going to lead this team to a Stanley Cup? Probably not. But Rick Bowness's main job was to fix this locker room. This locker room was a mess, highlighted by many players that played there already, making Winnipeg even less desirable to play in. So what did Rick Bowness do to start off his campaign in Winnipeg? He took away the captaincy from Blake Wheeler. A big first step and a big bold move, stepping into a new locker room with a new team. But it ended up working for the best. There was no captain that season for the Winnipeg Jets, and it allowed everybody to have a voice. Maybe players that didn't feel like they had one before could step into a role where they had one, and players that already had a letter on their jerseys, they could grow together with some other players and create a real leadership group here. Now with a new coach comes new systems, and that was Rick Bowness's next challenge, getting this team to commit to structure and defense, something that they were absolutely not doing under Paul Maurice. There was no accountability under Paul Maurice. There was nobody getting benched, nobody getting sat, nobody losing ice time because of poor play. Under Rick Bowness, that would not be the case. Now with a new face behind the bench, changing the captaincy, and instilling new systems, the Winnipeg Jets, to everyone's surprise, had thrived. This was a team that was actually very good defensively, one of the best defensive teams in the NHL. They added some pieces at the trade deadline, acquiring Vladislav Nemesnikov and Nino Niederreiter to the team. The Jets bought into the systems and were able to grow together. One of the players that grew the most and was definitely the most impressive that season for Winnipeg was Josh Morrissey, a guy that was always viewed as a guy that had potential to be a top pairing defenseman but may never reach it, turned into a guy that would be getting Norris votes for the foreseeable future, playing 78 games and putting up 76 points. Under Paul Maurice, this would have never happened, as his systems didn't allow the Jets defensemen to really jump into the play freely at all, but under Rick Bowness, the defensemen are allowed to jump into the play offensively while still maintaining their structure, but being allowed to do these things allowed Josh Morrissey to reach his first round pick potential and turned into an absolute monster. Rick Bowness has also done this with players such as Victor Hedman in his career and Miro Heiskanen, two Norris caliber defensemen. Winning 46 games in Rick's first season, the Jets propelled themselves to the 8th seed in the Western Conference and would play the Vegas Golden Knights in the first round. After winning the first game of the series 5-1, the Vegas Golden Knights would gentleman sweep the Winnipeg Jets, winning the series 4-1. Rick Bowness was not happy after Game 5. He felt that his team did not show any fight in the final game and felt that there was no pushback, which led to this.
Overall thoughts, I'm so disappointed and disgusted right now. That's my thoughts. Pardon me? No pushback. But it's the same crap we saw in February. It was. That's why, so as soon as we were challenging for first place and teams were coming after us, we had no pushback. This series, we had no pushback.
What is it about this team leadership core or the top end players we've talked about?
We got to push back. There's got to be a pushback. There's got to be pride. You got to be able to push back when things aren't going your way. We had no pushback. They're better players. They're so much better than ours tonight. They deserve to win. They were the better team in the regular season. They were the better team in this series. Anything else? Good. Thanks.
Rick led that off by saying he was disgusted and disappointed in his team, something that hasn't been said about that team publicly by a coaching staff in a very long time. Right? There was no accountability under the Paul Maurice era, after the 2017-2018 season. And now with Rick Bowness at the helm, he wasn't taking that. He wasn't going to accept that. And, while the players probably didn't want to hear this right after a Game 5 loss and their season ending, I think Rick Bowness nailed it right on the head. This team didn't have any pushback, and he's challenging them to find that pushback and take the next step. This offseason was one of the most important and impactful in Winnipeg Jets 2.0 history. We'll start off with Pierre-Luc Dubois, whose contract situation was, quite frankly, a distraction for the entire season. He wanted to get paid. He wanted that long-term contract. It wasn't going to be in Winnipeg. After it was widely believed that he would be traded to the Montreal Canadiens, he was traded to the LA Kings in a package involving Gabe Vilardi. One of Rick Bowness's focuses was to try to convince Pierre-Luc Dubois to stay in Winnipeg, but Dubois had some other plans. Next up on the list, the Jets needed to figure out what they were going to do with Blake Wheeler. Blake was in his mid-30s at this point and starting to slow down and was no longer an effective top 6 player with all of the baggage that he carried, and getting the C stripped off of him earlier that season, the Jets thought it was best and time to cut ties with Blake Wheeler. The Jets would end up buying out the last year of his contract, and that would end the Wheeler era in Winnipeg. But where one era ends, another begins, as Adam Lowry was appointed the new captain of the Winnipeg Jets. Adam Lowry is a very for-the-crest guy, a guy that's going to get everybody to rally, a guy that's going to be putting 110 every single night, a big, gritty veteran forward who's going to always be sticking up for his teammates. This was a slam dunk pick by Rick Bowness and the Winnipeg Jets. Now, there was a lot of talk about Mark Scheifele and Connor Hellebuck, who both only had 1 year left on their deals. There was a lot of question marks here, and it took the entire summer, but the Winnipeg Jets were able to retain 2 of their biggest stars to matching 7-year, $8.5 million deals. Both players saw what was going on in the organization and the shift that was happening, and they both decided to buy in long-term for this team, signing long-term extensions. It would have been very easy for both players to walk and get an opportunity elsewhere to be big players. However, they both decided to buy into the team that was forming around them now with Rick Bowness at the helm. It didn't seem like anybody wanted to be in Winnipeg up until this moment, but with the culture shift, things started to change. With the offseason over, the Jets' next step was to push back from a really disappointing end to last season, and they did just that. The Jets ended with a 52-24-6 record. That was good for second in the Central, and most notably, the Jets were the number one team in goals against with only 198, the only team in the NHL to allow less than 200 goals the entire season. This was a very different team even from a year ago. Now without Blake Wheeler and Pierre-Luc Dubois, the Jets shocked everybody by having a 52-win season. Nobody saw this coming. While their power play wasn't their strong suit, their 5-on-5 game was some of the best in the NHL. The Jets even went ahead to add to this lineup, acquiring Tyler Toffoli and Sean Monahan before the trade deadline. This was definitely some pushback by the Winnipeg Jets. Rick Bowness challenged his club, he challenged his leadership group, and he challenged them all to take a step forward, and they did just that. This is something we haven't seen since 2017-2018. There was really no expectations on this team coming into the year. Nobody thought that the Winnipeg Jets were going to be more than a wildcard team coming into the season. But Rick Bowness challenged his team. He challenged them to be better defensively. He challenged them to improve their 5-on-5 game. He challenged them to take a step forward not only as players, but as leaders on the team, propelling Adam Lowry into one of the most respected captains in the NHL. He challenged his team to push back from what was a disappointment a year ago and prove to everybody that that wasn't the Winnipeg Jets. And now you take a look around the room, this wasn't just a bunch of individuals trying to figure out if they wanted to stay in Winnipeg long term, this was a team with some buy-in. While their regular season was very impressive, the Jets once again failed to get out of the first round, winning Game 1 at home, but ultimately falling in 5 games to the Colorado Avalanche, who, to their credit, were absolutely unbelievable in that series. Now, while this was a gut punch and it didn't feel like the Jets should be out this early in the playoffs, it was very clear that this team took a different approach mentally to this loss, using it as fuel, and many players taking it on the chin saying that they need to be better. In the past few seasons in Winnipeg, that would have been absolutely unheard of. This time around, the players taking ownership of their failures and using it as fuel for the next season. That is a huge change and the start of how you can become a real successful team. And that's all thanks to Rick Bowness. He challenged them multiple times in multiple different areas for the last 2 seasons, and the team is finally starting to become a real team. After many decades of coaching, that offseason, Rick Bowness would hang up the clipboard for good and retire from the NHL. There were a few different factors in his retirement, as he was getting up there in age, approaching 70 years old, and his wife Judy had some health scares during the year. This forced Rick to step away from the team at times, and associate coach Scott Arniel take over as acting head coach. Rick Bowness did an incredible job as head coach of the Jets, leading them to a 98-57-9 record and really turning a bunch of individuals into a team. However, with the lack of playoff success, it was time for the Jets to go in a new direction and build off of what Rick Bowness had already built up. They wouldn't have to look far, however, for their next bench boss, as Scott Arniel was hired shortly after the Rick Bowness retirement. Under Rick Bowness, players such as Nino Niederreiter, Vlad Namestnikov, previously mentioned Mark Scheifele and Connor Hellebuck, amongst others, had decided to re-sign back in Winnipeg. This left Scott Arniel with a pretty good roster to contend with, and now it was his job to not only continue what Rick Bowness has built up in the locker room, but now improve upon it further. After a disappointing exit to the 23-24 playoffs, the Winnipeg Jets used that as fuel. Under new leadership of Scott Arniel and a new bench as a whole, the Jets went on to win the President's Trophy. This was the first President's Trophy in franchise history, as they started off hot, setting an NHL record best start of 15-1-0, and not only turned in their first President's Trophy, but their first ever Central Division title win. It was up to Arniel to continue to try to get the best out of his players, and that season he absolutely did, as Mark Scheifele and many others were putting up career numbers, and even Connor Hellebuck somehow improving on his career bests, winning his 3rd Vezina and being nominated for the Hart Trophy. They would even go ahead and sign even more players to extensions, such as Alex Iafallo to a very team-friendly deal, as well as Vlad Namestnikov to yet another extension to stay in Winnipeg. Arneal was able to build on Bones' foundation and take it into the playoffs and would play the 8th seed St. Louis Blues, who were on an absolute heater at the end of this season. The Jets started off hot in the first couple of games, but this one needed 7, and in Game 7 they were down with 2 minutes left against the Blues at home, and the Jets were able to score with 1.6 seconds left, creating the miracle in Manitoba and sending this to overtime, where Adam Lowry would score on a tip shot from Neil Pionk to send the Winnipeg Jets to the second round. In years under Paul Maurice, I don't think you see this comeback happen. You know, we've seen the Winnipeg Jets in the past kind of dull out and not really be able to come back from adversity. This Jets team, every single time they needed to come up big in the clutch or overcome some adversity or just to shut some people up, they did that all year long. This was the first time that the Jets passed the first round in quite some time since the Maurice days, and now they were off to face Dallas. The Jets would fall in Game 6 to the Dallas Stars in what was a deeply emotional day for everybody in Winnipeg. Mark Scheifele's father had passed away just hours before the game had started, and we weren't sure if we were going to see Mark Scheifele play in this crucial game for Winnipeg. However, Scheifele courageously did end up suiting up for his team and even ended up scoring a goal. It was very touching to see him score that goal. That one was for his father, and you could just see the whole team just super happy for him. However, late in the third period, Mark Scheifele would take a penalty to save a breakaway late in the third. This game was tied. We'd go to overtime where the Dallas Stars would score on that power play. Mark Scheifele was in the box, completely dejected, when Captain Adam Lowry went to go fish him out of the penalty box. Really touching moment, giving Scheifele a hug. And, you know, it was just a really hard time watching that handshake line. I can't remember a time where it's been that emotional. Every Dallas Stars player giving Scheifele a big hug and words of encouragement, and all of the Jets waited by the tunnel for Mark after he was done shaking hands. This was a really emotional moment, but a really classy moment by the Winnipeg Jets, and even though they had fallen in the second round, Dallas was the better team. It was a very good series, and Dallas ended up going to the third round. But this moment stuck out to me the most, and maybe the most important moment of the entire season for the Jets. Forget the awards, forget the records. This right here, a moment bigger than hockey. This wasn't just a team, this was a family. Rick Bowness wasn't hired to win a Stanley Cup in Winnipeg, he was hired to fix the locker room, and he did far more than just that. He gave players a voice. He took the C away from a player that maybe wasn't going to lead this team to where they needed to go, and he put it on a player more deserving in Adam Lowry. He unlocked the potential of Josh Morrissey, turning him into a Norris-caliber defenseman. He demanded that this team buy in to the structure that he was running and play defensively. But above all, he turned this team into a family. Before the Rick Bowness era, not a lot of players wanted to sign in Winnipeg because of the awful culture that was, very publicly known, and just the poor play that this team was producing. But now, it really seems like the Jets have a hard time finding players that don't want to stay in Winnipeg. Guys like Nino Niederreiter, Dylan DeMello, Vlad Nemesnikov, Alex Iafallo, Neil Pionk, among others, have all re-signed back in Winnipeg. Just days after suffering a hard second-round loss to the Dallas Stars, the Jets' exit interviews were full of praise for this team, the franchise, and many players saying they want to be a Jet for life. This was a dramatic turnaround from where the Jets were 3 to 4 years ago, and where the team is headed now is all up to Scott Arneal and Kevin Cheveldayoff. Rick Bowness is enjoying his time being retired, but you can still find him from time to time on the Sportsnet or the TNT panel in between periods talking hockey. When Rick Bowness was hired, it was viewed as a bit of a disappointment and a bit of a whiff by the Winnipeg Jets not being able to land Barry Trotz, but it might have been the best thing to ever happen to the franchise, as who knows where the Jets were headed. Would they be able to re-sign Mark Scheifele and Connor Hellebuck? I'm not so sure. Would the locker room be the way it is now? I know for a fact it wouldn't be. He completely changed the DNA of this hockey team, and that's how Rick Bowness had saved the Winnipeg Jets.
I hope over my career that it's not winning the Stanley Cup. It's always been important, but over the years as you age, you hope you have an impact on your players' lives, off the ice, on the ice. And that's been more important to me over the last 10 years. I've had some runs at the Stanley Cup, and things happen that are out of your control with injuries and everything, and then you lose the cup and okay, things happen out of your control. What is in your control every day is the impact that you can have on your players on and off the ice. That is within a coach's control, and I've always taken great pride in that. After a while, you get close to the cup, you lose, and you say, God, we're healthy, we could have won that. Well, that's out of your control. As a coach, you can control what you do, how you deal with the players every day, and that's helping them on the ice, and you hope that you teach them some life lessons along the way as well.